Sustainability is not something you typically associate with Fashion Month. Thousands of new clothes being produced, hundreds of people flying across the globe and driving to and from shows, and the constant push for newness and the glamorization of consumerism. This September, brands seem determined to change that image. In fact, we saw more references towards sustainability than ever before at a Fashion Month. But does it mean there's actual progress happening? Let's talk about it. Before we do though, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. If you're new here, my name's Katie. I talk about sustainable fashion topics, personal style, and a lot of industry news. So if that sounds interesting to you, then you can subscribe to my YouTube, you can listen to my podcast, or you can follow me on any of the other social media handles that I'm on. But let's get into the video, which is a Fashion Month special dissecting whether sustainability was actually present during September's Fashion Month. Two quick little notes. The first part of this video, I suppose, was one I did at the beginning of this month calling out luxury fashion, and I definitely suggest watching that if you haven't already to get an overview of luxury fashion's current commitments towards sustainability, which, spoiler alert, are definitely lacking. And the second is the way I'm going to lay out this video. I'm going to first talk about examples of sustainability and activism and new materials that were showcased during Fashion Week. Then I'm going to move into an analysis of the wider industry's approach towards sustainability so we can understand whether this sudden push towards sustainability was more of a marketing gimmick or whether it's an actual reflection of brands' sustainability commitments right now. And then finally, I'm going to do a really quick summary. So feel free to skip around to what interests you. I'm going to put the chapters in the description below so it's really easy to navigate. Finally, let's get into it. Like I said in the intro, sustainability was quite big this Fashion Month. Like, I was quite surprised at how much it was mentioned and referenced by an industry that seems determined to ignore it. In my mind, there were two big moments towards sustainability that I want to point out. The first was how much secondhand fashion was on display. London Fashion Week opened with two runways from secondhand platforms, eBay and Oxfam, where all of the looks were secondhand, curated by an in-house designer. And I think the fact that London Fashion Week opened with these designs really said a lot towards how secondhand fashion is being normalized in the industry and in society. Also to note that New York Fashion Week had a secondhand runway 2 done by Remake, which was also really great. The second big moment for sustainability that I noticed was Diesel's catwalk in Milan, which really centered around textile waste and bringing that to fashion's attention. The catwalk was absolutely covered in denim scraps from the brand's factories. Apparently it was 15 tons worth of scrap materials which lined the floors, lined the pillars, like you could not look away from it. And according to the brand, that material is going to be repurposed after the show, but was put there to highlight the beauty in waste. I'm not 100% sure of the brand's commitments, but I really liked how they put fashion waste on the main stage at New York Fashion Week. Something else I noticed this season was that activism was the biggest trend, both from brands and organizations. There were so many examples, so I'm just going to highlight a handful. New York Fashion Week started with a voting awareness march where Jill Biden was joined by Anna Wintour and other major designers to encourage people to vote in the upcoming US presidential election. The sentiment was also carried out throughout the shows. There was a designer that wore a vote t-shirt when he came to take his final bow on the stage. And I completely get the sentiment. Obviously, this is an important presidential election, and it's good that fashion is encouraging people to exercise their right to vote. But to me, it feels a little bit hypocritical that fashion and major names in the industry are going all in to campaign for voting when this energy isn't reciprocated towards the climate crisis, to which fashion is directly tied to and has the power to improve. Kind of just makes me think that the people in charge are finding it much easier to campaign for something they don't have control over than taking responsibility and showing some actual commitment to something they can control. One of the most eye-turning examples of activism during Fashion Month was the All Foundation's clothing waste zombie, which literally walked the streets of major fashion capitals and highlighted the issue of textile waste in the industry. Obviously, this is a really timely reminder during Fashion Month, especially because of how much overproduction and consumerism is on display at all of the fashion weeks. Stella McCartney was one of the brands that put activism front and center on their runway. She campaigned for the end of leather use in fashion and for the end of feathers, and alongside that, just a cruelty-free fashion industry, which is obviously a message everyone can get behind. However, one of Stella McCartney's shareholders is LVMH, a fashion brand that has a lot of Italian leather goods brands also under its umbrella. And maybe this message should have been directed to Bernard Arnault, the owner of LVMH. I get the whole idea of calling it out to the public though, and I do definitely get behind that, but it does feel a little silly when her brand is partially financed by LVMH. There was a lot of disruptive action by PETA, who stormed the Hermès show in Paris, the Burberry one in London, Dior in Paris, and they were actually partners with Stella McCartney in New York. And their campaign was the same as hers, advocating for a leather and feather-free industry. The Hermès show in particular was targeted because of the recent findings from an undercover report of a crocodile farm owned by the brand, which showed a lot of animal rights abuse. And finally, there was a lot of climate action on display. One of the best examples was Paulina Strada, a New York-based designer whose collection included a lot of dead stock and recycled materials, and who soundtracked her show to 2000s pop music with lyrics changed. Particularly the song Pieces of Me by Ashley Simpson, where the lyrics were changed to say, "Enjoy the seasons now because they won't last." Another sustainability trend I wanted to highlight from this fashion month was the rise of next generation materials on display. We saw the first example of a designer at New York Fashion Week showcasing Cirque Lyocell, which is an alternative to silk, which luxury fashion houses should be paying attention to. We also saw major luxury brands like Coach featuring upcycled materials like post-consumer denim. Ganni featured a whole host of innovative materials at their show in Paris, from an olive oil based leather alternative to psyllium, a bacteria grown leather. And one of my favorite examples was Caroline Vito, who used a seaweed based material for some absolutely gorgeous looks. To be fair, there was some really exciting new developments this fashion month that deserve celebrating. But hearing all these examples, I think the average person would walk away from this fashion month thinking that fashion is really taking sustainability seriously and really owning up to their part in it and thinking about how they can do better. But that is definitely what they wanted you to see and not the whole picture. Let's do a broader analysis, taking into account all of those examples I've given you and how they actually compare to what fashion is doing. I think there's a complete lack of authenticity when it comes to fashion's commitments towards sustainability. They definitely want you to think they're doing more than they actually are. And thinking about a lot of those examples of activism at Fashion Month and brands using their runways to call out examples, feels like the call is coming from inside the house, if that makes sense. It felt like there was a lot of performative activism from brands, calling out luxury's issues, calling out the climate crisis and how we're not doing enough for it. But everyone was happy to send hundreds of new styles down the runway and completely ignore the biggest issue in fashion, which is overproduction. An article I read in Teen Vogue had the same takeaway. They listed examples of brands calling out climate change, democracy, misogyny, homophobia, reproductive rights, but also asked, does it matter when the larger takeaway from the shows is to sell clothes within a deeply flawed system that prioritizes overproduction and capital over everything? And something else I read from the CEO of Remake on LinkedIn also summed it up quite well. She said that for a creative industry, the lack of imagination around sustainability sustainability at New York Fashion Week is astounding. Mostly just slogan tee platitudes while we continue to exploit and overproduce. So I think I wasn't the only one to come away from Fashion Month thinking that there was a real lack of authenticity. I also think there's a real lack of progress, and there are stats to back me up. A new report that came out around Fashion Month shows that less than 4% of the brands associated with the British Fashion Council are able to demonstrate any emission reduction targets. And only 2.4% of those brands have demonstrated science-based targets that align with the Paris Agreement, which is just basic sustainability principles at this point. Like, no brand has an excuse to not have Paris-based climate targets. Of course, you might also be aware that Climate Week happened just after New York Fashion Week. And if you were paying attention to these headlines over New York Fashion Weeks, then you'd have a much bleaker outlook on the situation for sustainability in fashion. Business of Fashion reported that there was a buzz around this year's event and that there was a lot more representation from fashion than there normally is. But despite fashion's increased presence, efforts to move the needle on climate action felt as gridlocked as the traffic in Midtown Manhattan. During Climate Week, fashion was reprimanded for its need to move away from fossil fuels and its need to finance the transition towards cleaner energy alternatives in the global south, rather than just letting them foot the bill. Of course, fashion has been told this before and hasn't listened. The need for newness and profits is too great, and companies are just prioritizing profit over everything. One really interesting thing Business of Fashion reported was a notice that came from Bank of America at the same time as Climate Week kicked off. According to BOF, it shows where fashion's priorities lie. In an analysis of luxury fashion's market slowdown, the Bank of America recommended luxury brands concentrate less on the quiet luxury trend that a lot of brands have been using as a front for sustainability, thinking that they could market it as a way for people to buy less, buy better quality, and instead focus on driving new volume by emphasizing newness and fashion content. Basically, Bank of America thinks that slow fashion is not profitable enough, and if luxury fashion wants to stay afloat, then it needs to keep producing and getting us consumers to consume. Around the same time as this, Vogue also released a report that was quite damning in its expose of how luxury fashion has been committing to sustainability. It highlighted the fact that time-sensitive targets are being missed by the whole fashion industry, meaning brands are being less ambitious about their sustainability targets and they're missing the deadlines of prior targets that they had in place already, including those set for the Paris Agreement. They also highlighted the fact that consumer-led circularity projects are taking priority for brands, especially over other circularity initiatives which mainly focus on behind-the-scenes business and supply chain logistics, which again kind of proves the point that fashion really only cares about sustainability when they can market it to consumers. The last thing I want to highlight as an example of fashion not taking sustainability seriously is the lack of size inclusivity at Fashion Month this past season, but also in seasons prior. I did a video on size inclusivity slipping back in February on this channel, and Vogue's newest report shows that this past season was also lacking inclusive body types. Vogue speculated that the body positivity movement has lost steam, and they also blamed the rise of Ozempic as a reason for thinness currently trending and us seeing it more on the catwalks. So I think from all those examples, it's pretty safe to say that brands aren't prioritizing sustainability in meaningful ways. Maybe in public-facing ways, but not when it comes to behind the scenes and a lot of tangible results. Let's talk about why quickly. Sarah Kent from Business of Fashion summed up really nicely in her report. Fashion execs are grappling with a sluggish market, geopolitical uncertainty, and disruptive new technologies, basically meaning AI, that are diverting attention away from grappling with climate risks, which to CEOs are hard to value, often cost a lot of money, and frequently deliver intangible results. She also cited a recent report that shows that sustainability is apparently slipping down the priority list for CEOs at major companies, thanks to all of the reasons I just gave. The general understanding is that brands aren't going to make very tangible changes until legislation comes into play. But although that definitely should be helpful, it's slow to come and it's a little bit wishy-washy. We've seen recent progress, like the California textile recycling bill being signed in, which means that brands will be responsible for the waste they create, and is a great move towards increasing recycling of old clothes. I also think that some of the legislation isn't doing enough. During New York Fashion Week, a report came out from the New York City Council, which recommended some targets towards the fashion industry for improving their sustainability, like driving down fossil fuel, like leaving out animal-based materials. And I have to say, their recommendations seemed a little bit generalized and a little bit lacking. Trying to ban wool, for example, feels a little derivative. I mean, yes, there are unethical ways to get wool. There are also regenerative farmers doing great work to make sure that this natural, biodegradable fabric is ethical and could solve a lot of problems towards an industry focused on polyester. They also weirdly focused on reducing down promotional products like tote bags, which I completely, understand. The amount of tote bags given out in fashion is criminal. But I don't know how much impact focusing on tote bags is going to have when fashion is producing billions of garments of clothes annually. Surely we should be tackling that as well. Okay, if you just skipped all of the video or you watched it maybe and you're still a little confused on the outcome, here's the executive summary. We saw more big public declarations towards sustainability from brands this fashion month. We also saw lots of activism from all aspects, political, environmental, social, but the statistics say that a lot of it is just lip service, and brands are failing to make tangible change beyond these empty public promises. They're prioritizing actions that make it look like they care over decisions that would make the most impact. Worse is that in some areas, fashion is stalling or regressing, such as their commitment towards size inclusivity and not meeting targets that were set for the Paris Agreement goals. All in all, I would say that if you came away from Fashion Month thinking that brands and fashion councils actually care about sustainability, then you may have been greenwashed. But I'd love to know what you guys think. Obviously, I couldn't include every single piece of sustainability news from the month, so drop the ones that you love the most in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will speak to you really soon. Have a lovely day. Bye.